To get a sense of exactly what's going on, I want to bring in our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert. Right, we've heard about the 3 villages that have been liberated, so say Ukraine. Tell us about the minutiae and what perhaps the strategy is behind this.
What's going on here, right? Because we're not going to start saying, has the counteroffensive begun again? We've been going on about that for days and weeks now. Look, what the Institute for the Study of War, which has become an authority on this entire war in Ukraine, says we're seeing is an extraordinary, difficult tactical operation, or rather a series of tactical operations by the Ukrainian forces, what can also be called multi-pronged assaults. And why I say multi-pronged is because it's not happening all in one area. You know, you have this image, a counteroffensive. They're going to strike, as they did last fall in Kharkiv, repel, dislodge the Russian occupiers, and that's over. This is what we really have is what's being called probing operations. The Ukrainian forces are testing the Russian defenses, essentially, along that 1,100-plus kilometer front line, which extends, as you know, Gavin, all the way from the northeast, the Kharkiv region, all the way down to the southwest, to Zaporizhia, that Kakhovka Dam region, and even off the map here, Odessa. You can see what we're talking about here. It is a very extended region. The Ukrainians are betting that the Russians do not have enough manpower or equipment power to be able to hold the entire 1,100-kilometer front line. So there may be surprises here. They're looking for weak links. Now, you mentioned the village of Blahodatne. That is in the Donetsk region, also sort of on the edge between Donetsk and the Zaporizhia region. And the brunt of these tactical operations right now, if you want to sort of boil it down, and remember, we're talking through the fog of war, it's really hard to independently confirm and corroborate a lot of this. We're basing it on military bloggers. We're basing it on reports from the field. We're basing it on satellite imagery. But what we can generally say that there is fierce fighting raging around this area, Donetsk region, going also north towards Luhansk region, occupied by the Russians. The Zaporizhia region, where Europe's largest nuclear plant right now has been the center of a lot of attention. Big area of focus. Why? Because if the Ukrainians can breach this area and push south, they can ultimately try to encircle Russian forces and cut off a supply link between occupied annexed Crimea and the Russian occupying forces to the north. And finally, you also have Bakhmut up here. Bakhmut, you'll say, well, why is there fighting going on there? Didn't the Russians claim to have captured Bakhmut last month in May? Well, yes, but it's complicated, to say the least, because Bakhmut's been devastated. It's destroyed. As Zelensky said, it doesn't really exist anymore. But the Russians must protect the ruins of that battlefield. So it still remains very symbolic. And for the Ukrainians, there is a stake here, and that is perhaps trying to divert Russian forces in other areas so they can make surprise attacks somewhere else. I'm not going to say to take these claims of capturing these settlements with a grain of salt. But that said, you do have to put it in context, because these tactical operations are running up against very stiff Russian resistance, and we're only seeing a tiny little snapshot, a tiny cross-section of what's going on along this front. There's lots of known unknowns and unknown unknowns here.
There's a lot at play, and this map is very useful, as you point out. So go right at the top. We had a few weeks ago what's called shaping operations, where perhaps pro-Ukrainian Russian groups involved in trying to stop supply lines, explosions, drones. Down here, you talked about Crimea ideally being cut off, so you stop the supply line into Crimea, the bridge being destroyed fairly recently, being rebuilt again. When you have this dam, add that to the mix, flooding here, militarily potentially stopping.
It's tough.
It's tough. They were successful in a counteroffensive in Kherson, but you think this time it's going to be tougher going?
Kherson took a while as well. It's a very tough terrain, and this is going to be a tough slog for the Ukrainians. Remember, their goal, their military objective, according to Zelensky, remains to dislodge the Russian occupiers from all the territory, almost 20% of Ukraine right now, that they occupy, dislodge them, repel them, push them back, recapture that territory. This is a tough slog, including Crimea. Up to and including Crimea. This, around Zaporizhia, is flatland, flatland. Very few places to duck for cover and defenses. It's very difficult. But here's the toughest part. Yes, the Ukrainians are going on these tactical operations equipped with bristling with the new Western weaponry. The Bradley tanks, the Abrams armor, the tanks, they have, a lot of the munitions as well. But what do the Russians have done? The Russians have had a lot of time to dig their own defenses. And what you're getting along a lot of this region, especially Zaporizhia, this is where you're seeing some of the absolute most formidable Russian defenses, perhaps that we've seen since the trenches, since World War I, World War II as well. We have thinly manned lines of Russians who are ready to sort of probe when there's a Ukrainian assault, to see the Ukrainians coming, to give notice. And then what you have behind that is you have very deep trenches that the Ukrainians would have to get across, very deep trenches along this whole ridge line here. And behind that you have minefields. So the trenches, then the minefields, and behind the minefields you have divisions of assault troops, Russian assault troops, which are ready to rush forward to try to thwart, to stop the Ukrainians if they were to get through those trenches and mines. We are not talking about a cakewalk. Far from it. We are talking about a potentially long, hard slog, but one that the Ukrainians believe they will have the wherewithal to take on as long as they go about this methodically and coherently and consistently.
And it's about trying to give a picture of what's going on using open source material, using what's going on with our correspondents on the ground, and what both sides are saying, which is completely different.
Completely different. And you'd expect both sides to have completely different messaging, right? Russians, essentially their message from the Ministry of Defense boils down to, carry on, nothing to see here, everything's just fine. In fact, the Russians have been claiming in the past few days that they've been just repelling these unsuccessful, as they see it, Ukrainian counteroffensives. Vladimir Putin himself making a rare statement about the operation, saying basically the Ukrainian counteroffensive's failing, already dismissing it out of hand. The Ukrainians taking exactly the opposite approach. You now know their famous video campaign with the soldiers putting their fingers to their lips, the shh. Plans love silence. They are being deliberately very, very coy, very, very silent, if you will, about what their actual plans are. Even their communication may be meant to divert us. There may be fighting taking place in places we have no idea of right now. The Ukrainians' silence remains their greatest asset, their greatest category. But they are making the claims, as you said at the top here, of having captured these small settlements, these 3 settlements in the Donetsk region, bordering the Zaporizhia region as well, which, whether they're on behind the Russian defensive lines or actually sort of in Ukrainian territory, symbolically it will give them a little bit of a morale boost. Both sides, very different messaging, but there is fierce fighting raging along multiple fronts, and that makes this a very complicated war and counteroffensive to try to follow and decipher in the absence of easily verifiable information.